In this episode, we explore the ignorance and greed that led to our current crisis.
One of the first rules in medicine is do no harm. Said that Hippocrates was the first to say this. And what that means is that the cure for any medical problem shouldn't be worse than the disease that you're trying to treat.
A big chunk of America is in chronic pain, and it's pain that's back pain, knee pain, arthritis, and it's real, and it affects people's lives, and they would like a way to live their lives, to take care of their families without being in this pain.
The brain in pain is a different brain than a normal brain that's not in pain.
People have it in their head that there's a pill for something, regardless of whatever my pain is. There's something out there that's going to help you. And there was this new miracle drug. It's going to eliminate all your pain.
Inside the company, when the drug came out, it received so many letters from people who had been suffering for years with no relief, who finally felt like through OxyContin, they were getting to be alive again in a way they hadn't for years, and that they considered a miracle drug.
The best thing that happened to me, if I wasn't on this medication, I just wouldn't be able to do the things that I'm doing now.
There's no question that our best, strongest pain medicines are the opioids. They do not have serious medical side effects.
Patients are just ATM machines. The more you go back to that patient and the more you push buttons, the more profit you can be made.
If you have lots of opioid prescriptions going out and you have people coming back all the time to get refills, they're always there for their appointment, even if their dose is going up. That's good for your practice. They thank you. They say everything's fine, even though after a while, if you study them, the patients actually aren't doing as well.
The pharmaceutical companies also were not entirely transparent about the addictive effects of opioids. And doctors were told they were non-addictive when in fact they were addictive.
We don't get taught in medical schools about illnesses that we induce. We only get taught about illnesses that we're supposed to cure.
We also grew up thinking that doctors were always right. So if you have a prescription, it's fine.
When we talk about opioid painkillers, we are essentially talking about heroin pills.
The drug companies are the cartel, the doctors are the pushers, and the pharmacists are the suppliers. That's how the DEA is seen.
There's not a city in the United States right now that doesn't have a major opiate addiction problem. And it's not just in cities, it's in rural areas. In fact, in some places, it's worse in rural areas than anywhere else.
At the peak of the epidemic, millions of people in the United States were prescribed 259 million prescriptions of opioids.
It means on average every adult is on one opiate, once or twice a year, if not more. It scares the living crud out of me.
The pharma companies, if they're making products that are making lots of money and they can start saying to themselves, yeah, but we're really meeting a need. We're really meeting a need. Well, we're also making a lot of money.
Opioids are a major category of medical spending. According to the Centers for Disease Control, it's about $24 billion in direct costs for the medications, another $75 billion in healthcare costs.
People are doing an OxyContin 80-10 pack a day. That's $1,000 worth of medication a day. Kids were spending hundreds of dollars a day, if not thousands. And heroin walked into town. And it's cheap, really cheap, really inexpensive, readily available. The shame of addiction keeps us from knowing the actual numbers. But at least 2 million Americans, and probably millions more, are addicted to prescription opioids.
Prescription drugs are now causing more deaths, for example, than car accidents.
From 1999 to 2017, over 500,000 Americans have died from an opioid overdose. More than all the Americans killed on the battlefield since World War II.
We have skyrocketing rates of infants born opioid dependent, of children winding up in the foster care system because their parents were addicted.
Kids growing up without parents, parents who have lost children, you have families decimated, you have towns destroyed, and to think that it started off with a company in Stamford, Connecticut that had some marketing material.
This is the worst man-made epidemic in the history of American medicine.
It's very clear when one looks at the overprescribing of opioids that's led to this public health crisis that the medical community really forgot the first rule, which is do no harm.
Opioids are among the world's oldest known drugs. Their medical, religious, and recreational use predates recorded history. These early drugs, such as opium, codeine, and morphine, were extracted from poppy flowers.
And it's some kind of mystery of nature. Why did the poppy plant create morphine that can bind to the opioid receptors in human brains? And probably that's a mystery of nature we'll never be able to answer, but that is the case because it's chemically similar to the compounds that our own brain makes.
In 1874, an English chemist, by mixing morphine and other acids, created a powerful opioid that was eventually called diacetylmorphine. Nothing much resulted from his discovery. 23 years later, a German chemist, working for what is now the Bayer Pharmaceutical Corporation, created the same substance. Bayer quickly promoted the drug as less dangerous than morphine, as well as a cough suppressant. Because of the heroic feelings recipients experienced, they called it heroin.
Heroin is a very slight chemical manipulation of the morphine molecule, makes the compound heroin much more fat soluble. The brain is mostly fat. So if someone is exposed to heroin, it gets into the brain many, many times faster than morphine would.
The more rapid a drug gets to the brain, if we were to learn in humans, the more apt it's to cause a high.
This heroic drug, originally promoted as a cough suppressant and for other common conditions, was soon diverted and abused. In 1924, the United States Congress banned heroin, declaring it a dangerous, addictive, illegal narcotic.
It probably would take too long for me to provide a theory of why, as Americans, we have such love affairs with drugs that potentially can kill us.
Opioid addiction led doctors to fear its use for anything but short-term acute pain or end-of-life palliative care.
That was a time when the medical community did understand that opioids needed to be prescribed cautiously. They're obviously important medicines for easing suffering at the end of life. They play an important role when used on a short-term basis for severe acute pain, for example, after major surgery.
Eventually, scientists started creating new semi-synthetic opioids similar to heroin. In 1917, oxycodone was one of several semi-synthetic opioids developed in Germany.
You literally start with opium to make hydrocodone and oxycodone. And the effects that hydrocodone and oxycodone produce in the brain are indistinguishable from the effects produced by heroin. If you give an experienced heroin user oxycodone and heroin, it's hard for that heroin user to tell which is which. In fact, if you ask them which they like a little bit better in like a blind taste test, which was a study they did at Columbia University, the oxycodone is preferred to the heroin. So what I'm saying is that when we talk about opioid pain medicine, we're essentially talking about heroin pills.
In 1892, doctors John Purdue Gray and George Frederick Bingham started the Purdue Frederick Company on Manhattan's Lower East Side. In 1952, it was sold to two other doctors, Raymond and Mortimer Sackler. In the intervening years, they expanded the company to other states, moving the headquarters to Stamford, Connecticut, and changing the name to Purdue Pharma.
Purdue is owned by a private family. Many of them are doctors, many of them are philanthropists. They've made a lot of money, billions. But they're not your typical rich people, yachts, dating models, things like that. They're intellectual people. They care about science, cancer research, arts.
A third brother, Dr. Arthur Sackler, revolutionized pharmaceutical advertising. Arthur originated a blitz-style marketing of drugs aimed at general practitioners through medical conventions, ads with well-known doctor endorsements, direct mailing, and a sales force giving out free samples and perks.
Valium, for the response you know, want, and trust.
His 1963 campaign for the new tranquilizer, Valium, touted it as a safe, non-addictive stress reliever. Women particularly were targeted to cure the everyday stress of being a wife and mom. Valium became the first billion-dollar profit drug, leading to an addiction crisis by the mid-1970s. In 1987, Dr. Arthur Sackler died a very rich man. His successful marketing strategies continued to live on at Purdue Pharma. Purdue began focusing on pain management. In 1972, they patented Contin, a controlled drug release system. Purdue Pharma believed that if they could link their 12-hour time release system Contin to an opioid pain reliever, it could be marketed for chronic pain without the sudden rush or heroin high to the brain.
There was an inherent logic to making long-acting opioids because obviously convenient, you'd have fewer doses in a day, but you'd also have fewer peaks and troughs, right? So you wouldn't have that sudden potential respiratory depression, you wouldn't have the breakthrough pain.
At the time, opioids had limited use for short-term, acute, and end-of-life pain. Neither are markets where fortunes are made.
You know, all of their sales materials were targeted to get the drugs out of the oncology suites and into the hands of local practitioners.
Purdue began funding organizations that endorsed long-term use of opioids for common conditions. In 1993, they established Partners Against Pain, quote, to help alleviate unnecessary suffering by advancing standards of chronic pain care through education. 1996 saw the launch of the 12-hour extended-release synthetic opioid designed to be safe for both acute and long-term chronic pain. They called their new revolutionary drug OxyContin. The next step was to convince the skeptical medical profession of the safety and effectiveness of their powerful new pain reliever.
Purdue, at the time it launched OxyContin in 1996, really opened new territory in terms of aggressive promotion of narcotics. They did things that really had never been seen before.
This new aggressive use of opioids, it wasn't driven by evidence that opioids were safer or more effective than we had previously believed. It was really driven by a brilliant marketing campaign.
OxyContin was really one of the first painkillers that was marketed to general internists and the public for moderate pain. They are the company that sort of originated the playbook.
Inspired by the Arthur Sackler playbook, Purdue launched a marketing campaign to sell OxyContin through multiple levels of attack. Blitz number 1, educate the medical community. From 1996 to 2001, Purdue conducted national pain management and speaker training conferences at resorts in Florida, Arizona, and California.
They're inappropriately influencing, maybe even corrupting 5,000 doctors, nurse practitioners, and nurses to sell the Kool-Aid.
Several videos were created aimed at both doctors and patients to encourage the use of opioids as long-term, safe methods to treat chronic pain. One such video was entitled, I Got My Life Back.
The video centers around Dr. Alan Spanos and his patients' personal success stories, thanks to OxyContin.
I got my life back now. Now I can enjoy every day that I live.
Since I've been on this new pain medication, I have not missed one day of work.
These videos were seen by about 15,000 doctors through direct marketing, seminars, and medical schools.
We now know that in patients who have no history of substance abuse, no history of chemical dependency, the likelihood that the treatment of pain using an opioid drug, which is prescribed by a doctor, will lead to addiction is extremely low.
People like Russell Portnoy and many others were teaching that addiction was rare and these falsehoods, and that we should be comforting people in chronic pain, just like we have learned to comfort people with cancer pain. And in fact, if you don't do that, you're probably going to be found wanting.
These are what is termed in the industry a KOL, or a key opinion leader. And if a drug company can hire these KOLs, they don't have to do the promotion themselves. And in fact, a lot of what the KOLs say to other doctors and other practitioners doesn't have to meet the same level of scrutiny by the FDA, doesn't have to even conform to the labeling instructions for the drug.
A generation of physicians were trained that opioids were effective for chronic pain and safe.
Blitz number 2, promote the drug. They increased their sales force and their physician call list. These sales reps were offered lucrative bonuses.
Their average compensation, a Purdue sales rep, was about $55,000, but they could get that increased by an extra $250,000 bonus if they could get enough doctors writing prescription. If you can increase your salary fivefold, you're going to cut corners. Who's the doctor writing the prescription for? Is that just a drug mill, prescription office? Those questions just were not asked.
Healthcare professionals received all kinds of promotional perks. OxyContin fishing hats, stuffed plush toys, musical compact discs, and of course the proverbial free lunch. Pharmaceutical companies were in our office all the time. You get pens and mugs and prescription pads with their products already written on it, so all you had to do was sign it. You get taken out to lunch, you can go to meetings, you go to the meetings, and there's a reception by... Those guys knew what they were doing, and they must have been good at it, or they wouldn't have done it. But what happened is they'd sort of ingratiate the physician to them to be beholding for the goodies that they provided for them.
There are guidelines for what the sales rep can and can't say, but you're not sitting in on that lunch. I'm not sitting in on that lunch. There's no recording or transcript of it. Who knows what is said?
Primary care doctors who fell for this began prescribing aggressively.
People always say follow the money, right? There's a considerable amount of money involved in the prescribing of opiates.
Purdue paid honoraria, speaking, and teaching fees to doctors boarding the OxyContin bandwagon.
He was taking about $100,000 a year, and then we looked to see how much the drugs that he was writing prescriptions for were costing us. And so the drugs he wrote for those drug companies cost us $500,000 a year.
The American Pain Foundation, the American Pain Society, the American Academy of Pain Medicine received millions of dollars from Purdue and other opioid manufacturers.
These AstroTurf organizations forming artificial groups meant to look grassroots.
So they can easily target doctors that are covering 80% of all of the narcotic prescriptions, and that's what Purdue did.
Blitz number 3, get the state and federal regulatory agencies on board, as well as the legislative branches.
Big Pharma is one of the most powerful lobby groups in Washington. They have armies of lobbyists that they use to reward congresspeople, to reward senators. Most of it is done legally and above the board. And in fact, if you look at the websites that are out there, you can see how much money is paid by each drug company to each senator and each congressman. But there's also a lot of sort of dark money that goes from political action committees and other organizations that we really don't know about. In our system of special interest politics, the special interests, unfortunately, often are the ones that carry the day.
When it comes to Purdue Pharma, there was essentially an unholy alliance between the company executives and the advisory board of the FDA that reviewed the drug.
Big Pharma is supposed to be regulated by the FDA, but unfortunately, through the PDUFA laws, Big Pharma is actually paying the FDA very large sums of money to review their drug applications.
Well, the FDA doesn't do independent testing. They've never done independent testing. They count on the drug companies to run clinical trials for them.
I was investigating whether company executives were essentially writing the advisory decision that legitimized approving this drug.
The Joint Commission that accredits healthcare organizations mandated pain be treated like the 5th vital sign. As patients routinely had their temperature and blood pressures checked, doctors were expected to ask each person to rate their pain on a scale from 1 to 10. Doctors and hospitals were admonished if they did not treat this pain.
The Joint Commission developed this pain as the 5th vital sign as part of a grant that was provided to them by the pharmaceutical company Purdue Pharma.
The Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations recently defined and adopted stringent pain standards.
One of the basic thrusts of our new standards is that organizations and practitioners have an obligation to ask the patient. Even if the patient doesn't look like he or she is in pain, ask them. You'll be surprised what you hear.
When you go to a doctor's office now, they ask you, are you having pain, even though you may go for a reason that has nothing to do with pain.
Which just added lighter fluid to the fire, because it became equivalent to say, if you have pain, you need opioids.
FDA policies have led us astray and have probably contributed to allowing these drugs getting out into the public almost in an unfettered way.
It is doubtful Purdue could have anticipated the financial success their drug would generate.
In 1999, the total amount spent on OxyContin was $48 million. That's since increased to $2.4 billion.
So they're making, at least in the United States, $2+ billion, list, and then probably net, they're making $2+ billion on OxyContin.
Purdue's marketing of OxyContin was, depending on how you look at it, very successful, very tragic.
All the marketing marketing, legislative maneuvering, cash, and free giveaways handed to doctors and politicians might have been justified if opioids were a safe, effective, non-addictive treatment for chronic pain. But they weren't.
My personal experience, that it wasn't working. That I was watching many of my patients deteriorate. I had a few deaths that, in retrospect, clearly related to my prescription.
Purdue's own sales reps were saying that the rate of addiction was only 1% with OxyContin, and that was clearly just false.
When you go back and look at the original data on which the claim that opioid use or pain medicine use for treating pain doesn't cause addiction is scary.
The rate of addiction amongst pain patients who are treated by doctors is much less than 1%.
They cited a study by Porter and Jick. Few bothered to check out the source of this critical statistic. In 1979, 17 years before the creation and introduction of OxyContin, Dr. Herschel Jick used Boston University's new crude database to satisfy his curiosity of how many hospitalized patients became addicted to opioids. Grad student Jane Porter helped compile the statistics. Dr. Jick wrote a paragraph. His secretary typed it up and submitted it to the New England Journal of Medicine. This short letter was one of the many printed in January of 1980. The paragraph simply stated the statistics and made no conclusions.
What everybody was citing as evidence that we didn't have to worry about getting our patients addicted, in some cases this was being described as a landmark study. It was this, a one-paragraph letter to the editor. This, of course, would tell you nothing about the risk of addiction when you put a patient on long-term opioids.
But it turns out, in fact, they have always been just as addictive as we always knew they were for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, when people used the poppy seed and the early derivatives of opium for pain control.
As patients began to exhibit symptoms of tolerance and addiction, Purdue Pharma was quick to pacify fears.
We were often taught that tolerance implied addiction, but it doesn't. Tolerance just means that you may need to increase the dose of the drug to get the same effect. But that doesn't go along with compulsive use of the drug, doesn't go along with any of the other things.
There was a concept of pseudo-addiction. What we were told was that if you had a patient coming in early who looked addicted, that it wasn't addiction, it was pseudo-addiction.
Pseudo-addiction is a fairly new term. It only came in about 1990, but it's crucial. Pseudo-addiction is when a patient is looking like a drug addict because they're pursuing pain relief. So pseudo-addiction is relief-seeking behavior mistaken as drug addiction.
It looked like addiction, but the problem wasn't the patient. The problem was the doctor wasn't giving a high enough dose, not enough pills. And because you were under-treating the pain, the patients were taking extra doses and coming in looking addicted.
Purdue's remedy for so-called pseudo-addiction actually endangered lives.
And so that if you had a patient who appeared addicted, the educational message was that you should increase the dose of the opioid, give them more opioids. And sure enough, if you give somebody who's addicted all of the pills that they could possibly want, they do stop coming in early. They spend the day in a narcotic stupor on the sofa.
The average daily dose went from about 80 milligrams a day to over 140 milligrams a day, just within a couple of years. And it shifted tremendously from the slightly weaker Schedule III opioids to the stronger, longer-acting Schedule II opioids.
So by now, the horse is out, the door's closed, and you've got people running around thinking, believing that they need these opiates to have a peaceful, successful life completely pain-free. Well, the price that they paid was their dependency and addiction to opiates.
Dr. Peter Grace, research assistant professor with the University of Colorado Boulder, published a study indicating that opioids, like OxyContin, when used long-term, increase chronic pain rather than ease it.
It's the long-term use that really isn't scientifically justified. And our study actually suggests that the long-term effects may not just be the absence of benefit, but actually that they may be causing long-term harm.
I think OxyContin is very addicting, especially when you're able to break it down and get that immediate rush. So if you're looking for that and have already, say, been using, even just taking pills orally or sniffing them, it's just an immediate rush.
Time-release opioids, when crushed, snorted, or injected, also gave a high or a rush to the brain, similar, if not better, than illegal heroin. Young people began diverting the drugs, prescribed or stolen from medicine cabinets, to get high. This, too, led to addiction and overdose.
The children using oxycodone, by children I mean people between the ages of 12 when you're starting up to 25, I call all those children. They crush the oxycodone. They can get a whole day's supply out of a sustained-release friable tablet.
There became two kinds of opioid addicts, the abusers, and those unknowingly addicted to a drug their trusted doctor had prescribed. In the 1990s, Linda Giannotti from Exeter, New Hampshire, sought treatment for back pain and fibromyalgia at her local clinic.
At one point, I was on 150 milligram, or however they do them, fentanyl patches, plus OxyContin, oxycodone. I had a woman that lives in my building said to me, "You're driving like you were drunk." And that was because of the opiates. I don't drink, so.
Right, and you never did anything other than what you were prescribed, as I remember.
Right.
Another practice was the off-label use of drugs. This is the use of drugs to treat ailments other than what they were designed for. Off-label use is not illegal or regulated by the FDA. Doctors began prescribing OxyContin for migraines and depression.
There's no law against writing the drug for an off-label use. So there might be the drug detail guy comes in your office and with a wink and a nod and says, "Yeah, you might want to use that drug, try that drug for this," but some other doctors we know have used it for that, even though it's not approved for that.
In addition to OxyContin, other opioids were put to off-label use. one of which was methadone, a drug used to treat heroin addiction.
For years, I had treated patients with heroin addiction with high-dose methadone, which is the appropriate treatment. And so I was thinking, well, I see how well that works for all these people, and they don't tend to overdose on it or have a lot of side effects or have any problems. So why wouldn't that be fine for pain patients?
I do recall an individual, a young man who had a rough go early in life, who had some problems with alcoholism, was in alcohol recovery. He had a number of back surgeries, and I was in the middle of a tapering course. Switched him over to methadone from his other drug to ease his taper, and using misguided conversion tables. 3 days after I converted him, I got a call from his wife that he had died, and I was flabbergasted.
It's not safe for people who just have chronic pain to give them opioids because they don't have the years of tolerance built up that people with heroin addiction have.
I didn't really understand the complexity of adding that drug as a reflection on guidelines for training. This was the published data. And I said, there's something wrong here. And that left a hole in my heart. I still remember him very, very clearly. He had opened up a shop, a small business, and was really getting on his feet. And he even gave me his AA 100-day token when he accomplished that.
Information was dribbling in that the opioid miracle pain relievers were killing people. If Purdue Pharma and the other drug companies would have acknowledged the potentially lethal effects of opioids when these problems were first discovered, hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved. Instead, they took steps to suppress negative information.
Within a month, we received a 3-page letter from Purdue Pharma basically saying, why are you bothering the doctors? This is not a prescribing problem. This is a patient misuse problem. This is a drug abuse problem. Patients need to be able to get what they need. And then a year later, got sued in federal court. We were all the medical directors were served in our homes.
Current efforts to stop this overprescribing have been met with much pushback from the pharmaceutical industry. They rationalized that the billions of dollars they were making were helping more people than they were harming. They insisted, and still insist today, that only those who are diverting and misusing the drugs to get high are responsible for the epidemic, and not those who are prescribed the drug. Purdue distributed a follow-up video to I Got My Life Back that doubled down on their claims that OxyContin was a safe, non-addictive, long-term chronic pain reliever.
Returning to these patients after 2 years shows that when pain treatment is successful, it stays successful.
Over the last 2 years, I've gotten much, much stronger.
It's just absolutely a godsend. It's just such a difference.
I've done well with it, and it's wonderful.
However, in time, even Purdue's own video poster children were succumbing to OxyContin's lethal effect. Of the 6 featured patients spotlighted in the videos, 3 maintained they were still helped by the product. 2 were deceased from causes thought to be related to their opioid addiction.
Had I not lost my medical insurance, or as I said, if I was to go to the mailbox once a month and I would find a bottle of OxyContin in it, I'd probably still be on it and I'd probably be dead.
Lauren is among the lucky survivors.
I would allow a doctor to prescribe me OxyContin right now. It's a synthetic heroin. I mean, good God, who would just knowingly want to just addict themselves to heroin, you know?
Very sadly, I think for a lot of people who are already hooked on these drugs, the future is probably very bleak. But that doesn't mean that you can't stop new addicts. It doesn't mean that new guidelines for people that have never taken the drug before can't be put in place to lower the number of prescriptions. Now, the pharma industry, they don't want this to happen. They are arguing not for less drugs, but better drugs. They are arguing for a new generation of opioid products that will be harder to abuse. And frankly, a lot of the products that they're coming up with don't really cut the mustard.
In 2010, Purdue introduced a new tamper-resistant OxyContin. With their spotlight focused on stopping pill mills and the new tamper-resistant medication, easy sources for prescription painkillers began to dry up. Prescription opioids were expensive on the black market. Heroin became a cheap alternative.
I can remember this 15 years ago when my patients coming in here for buprenorphine treatment were saying, you know, heroin's a lot cheaper than those pills, and it works better.
Individuals will take those prescription opioids, become addicted. It becomes too expensive to maintain their addiction, or they can't get it from their physician anymore. They turn to heroin or actually New Hampshire fentanyl.
The opioid you buy in the street is not ever safe. Quality control is non-existent. It's incredibly dangerous.
In 2016, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study that found that 76% of those seeking help for heroin addiction began by abusing pharmaceutical opioids, primarily OxyContin. This draws a direct line between Purdue's marketing of OxyContin and the subsequent heroin epidemic currently in the United States.
Policymakers were hearing that all of the problems related to opioids were from so-called drug abusers, and that these were wonderful medicines for pain patients, and we recognized this wasn't true.
One of the first people to stand up to the drug companies and lobby for reform was Dr. Andrew Kolodny. He helped form PROP, Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing. Their organization is one of the earliest advocates for opioid prescription reform.
It felt lonely early on when we found each other. It was almost as if we were a support group to find colleagues and to be able to talk with them and realize, you know, we're not crazy yet.
PROP, P-R-O-P, is Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, and it was started by Andrew Kolodny, who I believe really was a visionary who put words to what we were really seeing. He is an addiction psychiatrist, so I think he firsthand saw these people coming to him with addiction problems around the same time that we in the emergency department were seeing the overdoses and the chronic pain patients.
The founding members of PROP, we were from different specialties, from addiction, pain medicine, emergency medicine, public health, primary care, and what brought us together was a concern that opioids were being overprescribed. Purdue Pharma, more than any other pharmaceutical company, is responsible for our opioid addiction epidemic. It was Purdue that launched a campaign of misinformation when it put OxyContin on the market.
And he really put words to the issue. I mean, the Paul Revere of the opioid epidemic is coming and really sounded the cry to those who would listen.
Most patients with chronic pain on long-term opioids are not doing well. We are probably harming far more chronic pain patients than we're helping when we put them on long-term opioids. To help bring this crisis under control, the CDC is calling for reduced prescribing, especially for chronic pain. Unfortunately, the FDA has not been listening to the CDC. FDA continues to approve dangerous new opioids.
I think this testimony is amazing. The question is, you mentioned the FDA just keeps on licensing regardless. I think that's something that I am going to look into.
The one federal agency that seemed to understand that overdose deaths and addiction had risen as a consequence of the medical community overprescribing was the CDC.
You know, the FDA gets criticized a lot. The CDC really doesn't. I mean, the CDC is like, you know, they care about public health in America. It's the best and brightest. And they had kind of this blue ribbon committee that looked, I mean, people that had no ties to the pharmaceutical industry, no conflicts of interest to declare. And they spent a long time reviewing all of the research. And what they came back and said is incredibly damning. There's no evidence to support long-term use of opioids for chronic pain. What can any drug company say beyond that? Chronic pain is 87% of the market.
What separates the current opioid epidemic from the heroin and crystal meth epidemics of the past is that it affects white middle class and rural communities far more than urban minority poor.
Back to the early 80s, late 60s, the abuse and the negative consequences of the abuse of opiates was primarily, not exclusively limited to minority populations, poor individuals, inner city populations. From my perspective, what ended up happening is this current circumstance got a jumpstart from prescription opioids. And as a result of that, it impacted a much broader socioeconomic strata in our community, particularly individuals who have access to healthcare. Middle class, for the most part, white families.
What does the blue line indicate? Race. It's whites. African Americans would show up as red. You barely see it register at the bottom. So I'll tell you my theory for why our opioid addiction epidemic is so white. I think that the reason really boils down to the way in which doctors prescribe. If the patient is black or Latino, the doctor prescribes narcotics more cautiously. When the patient is black, the doctor may be more worried about the possibility of addiction or more worried about the possibility of diversion onto the black market. And when the patient is white, the doctor appears to be much more comfortable prescribing opioids, so that the black patient is less likely to get addicted to a medicine prescribed to them, and black households are much less likely to have opioid painkillers in their medicine chest. What I think is happening is that racial stereotyping is actually having a protective effect.
Basically, you have a lot of dead white middle-class kids and parents who are bereaved.
Those families were families that are used to influencing policy. Those are people who are not used to being quiet. Those are not people who've been beaten down and made to fear challenging our bureaucratic systems, and they expect to get answers. They expect to reach politicians and get change.
I think that really was a wake-up call for regulators, for public officials to treat this very differently.
In 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its executives pled guilty in federal court to charges of misleading the public about OxyContin's risk of addiction and ease of abuse. They were fined over $635 million, the biggest pharmaceutical settlement in U.S. history.
Now, that may sound like a lot. It is a lot, but if you look at the damage that's been done, particularly since then, in terms of the number of people that are taking not only OxyContin, but many types of opioids for conditions that really, there's no value for these drugs.
Today, the opioid epidemic commands national attention. There are now dozens of court cases against Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies for their collusion to promote drugs they knew were dangerous, for turning a blind eye to the sale of opioids to doctors and clinics that were pill mills, and for the destruction of states and communities ravaged by the epidemic.
I'm not sure I'm enough of a medical expert to say what steps need to be taken at this point. But you know, what's very clear is that unless you have public health experts, regulators, criminal investigators, local officials, and the medical community working together in some kind of established program, the problem will never get solved.
The one thing that we have to do is slowly and surely lock up the prescriptions. We need to get them lower.
Doctors are now strongly encouraged to cautiously prescribe for both chronic pain and acute pain. This will lessen the chance of surplus pills being diverted and abused. Surgeons at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire, recently published guidelines to reduce the number of excess opioid pills prescribed for acute pain.
What we found was that only about a quarter of the opioid pills that were being prescribed were taken by the patients. So it was clear that we were overprescribing these opioids. And so we came up with a guideline and said, okay, for a partial mastectomy, 5 pills should be enough to satisfy 80% of the patients. For laparoscopic gallbladder removal, cholecystectomy, 15 pills should be enough. We were worried, say, well, did a whole bunch of patients come back for refills? Were we really taking care of their pain okay? And the answer to that was we were taking care of their pain fine, because less than 1% of the patients ended up needing an opioid refill.
The notion of what you use to treat patients' pain is broad but simple. I lost my 12-year-old daughter to cancer, who was in severe pain, and almost never, ever had a narcotic. I have patients who I've done major operations with. Rarely do I use narcotics. Yet 30% of the patients who show up in our clinic are on narcotics. The most frequent phone call we get from patients is to renew their narcotics. I don't use narcotics. We've overused them, overtreated, and they're unnecessary.
Some doctors question the use of opioids at all and feel there are more effective non-addictive options even for acute pain.
When we think about treating patients in pain, we should understand what the ability of the body is to respond to those things themselves. We have endorphins. Can we stimulate those with activity and exercise? Oftentimes when somebody is in pain, we tell them not to move. That's bad advice. As we exercise, use our systems normally, we can create our own endorphins and pain control. That's number one. Number two is to go to over-the-counter medications.
For example, there are lots of good studies that show that the combination of taking acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, and ibuprofen, which comes in multiple forms like Advil and Motrin and Aleve, that the combination of those medications together actually is much more effective than opioids for taking care of acute pain.
We can use ice, heat, activity. We can talk about comedy, reading. There's things to divert people from pain. If we sit home all day in pain, we will guarantee you will have pain. If you try to be active, you won't necessarily get rid of it, but you'll learn to deal with it better. On the other hand, there are those patients, there's no alternative but to use narcotics. I can count those on one hand in any 1 month. It's very rare.
Doctors are getting the message that certain uses of opioids are not appropriate. For example, long-term chronic use. There are lots of educational programs out there. There are DEA enforcement activities out there. In fact, some doctors are now complaining that it's so hard to write a narcotic prescription that they don't even bother.
You talk to people who are chronic pain patients, and I get emails from these people on phone calls, who believe that their opioid prescription is working for them. They are very scared of the discussions going on. They're scared that their doctor's not going to be able to prescribe it, the federal government's going to take away their pills, and they're allowing them to have a quality of life that they don't believe is possible without the drugs.
There are a lot of patients that are that have pain, acute pain and chronic pain, that aren't addicts, that need to be treated properly with pain medication, and it does work for some people. So I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater.
There are about 10 to 12 million Americans who have been put on long-term opioids, many of whom may never be able to come off, and many of whom are convinced that the opioids are helping them. They're desperate to maintain their supply, and the idea of folks out there telling other doctors that these aren't safe and effective, that they don't work well long-term, they rightly believe that it could make it harder for them to continue to access opioids. And so from some of these pain patients who are on opioids, I've received threats, and it's often a threat of wanting to cause bodily harm so that I'll understand what their pain feels like, and maybe I'll have a different feeling about opioids if I was injured, that type of threat.
I do worry in some ways that now perhaps the pendulum is swinging so far the other way that we're going to see a lot of people sort of cut off from their long-term supplies of opiates, which are not appropriate for them to be on. But I imagine we'll be seeing those people coming to our addiction treatment programs as that begins to happen, as states put more restrictions in place for physicians.
People want to blame Big Pharma, say they're greedy, they're terrible, But the problem is that Big Pharma is the engine for medical innovation in this country. They develop drugs. They are willing to invest millions. They invested $40 million in OxyContin before they made a dime from it. So if we say let's make all of our drug companies nonprofits, we're not going to have a lot of innovative drugs that are going to cure cancer or address autism and things like that. So it's a problem, and the rest of the world is counting on American drug companies to come up with cures.
Chronic pain is truly a life-altering problem for millions of people. Scientists search for safe, non-addictive solutions for pain relief.
We can probably produce better drugs in terms of alleviating pain without the addictive component. In fact, some of the faculty here at the Sentinel Institute are working very hard on that.
Pain we need to treat. Pain is very important to treat. I've been studying the opiate system since my graduate studies in England. We cloned the opiate receptor. We found the gene which encoded the opiate receptor. We can block the inflammation in the brain, and we don't quite know what that will do. I think what's needed is drugs which don't work via opiate receptors necessarily, or drugs which work at opiate receptors but don't reach the reward system. There is some process in the pain field in developing new drugs.
The focus of our study is really to investigate the role that the immune system actually plays in chronic pain, and so that's a new angle to chronic pain research. We like to use the cells to actually validate the responses we find in animals. So we take tissue from animals as well as cells, analyze gene expression and protein expression and so forth. I think the really promising aspect of our study then is that these glial cells then are a target for treating pain better. So we could inhibit the glial cell activity, get rid of that prolonged pain, and actually improve the clinical efficacy of opioids, get rid of some of these problematic effects like tolerance, addiction, exaggerated pain.
I came to Stanford to understand how proteins, these very fascinating molecules, work at the most basic level. I'm an instructor in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Physiology, where we study very basic aspects of biology, and the work that we've been doing lately is to understand how opioids work, how they bind to their receptors and function. These models provide us really remarkable ways of developing new drugs. So what I'll do next is put up a drug like morphine, here in orange, bound inside its receptor. You can see it fits really nicely nuzzled into that binding pocket. I can kind of cut away, and you can see how well those little balls are fitting inside that receptor. So what we can do now is to say, well, this is the receptor binding pocket. What other drugs will fit in this binding pocket? And then can we use this kind of knowledge to develop better drugs that act at these receptors? A non-addictive opioid would be a medication that targets the mu opioid receptor, turns it on, provides pain relief, but doesn't trigger the rewarding pathways in the brain that cause tolerance or cause addiction.
With these other drugs that target different systems, like glial cells coming down the pike, we could actually see either a complete turnover in the drugs that are actually used to treat pain, or we could actually apply these drugs to improve the clinical profile of opioids. So opioids could still be administered, but if we shut down the glial signaling that occurs at the same time, then we can eliminate these problems of tolerance, addiction, and as I said earlier, the persistent pain that occurs as well.
Despite all the attention focused on the opioid epidemic, the crisis continues to grow. According to the CDC, in 2016, there were over 62,000 deaths due to overdose.
This is the worst man-made epidemic in modern medical history, and we still haven't reversed it, and we've known about it for more than 10 years. So where are these teachers that taught us to do these things? Why aren't they out there helping to reverse this?
During the making of this documentary, we sought to interview representatives from Purdue and the pharmaceutical industry, and those doctors who advocated for the use of opioids. None would appear on camera. This is a common problem experienced by most journalists covering the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, I would love to talk to anyone from Sackler family because they're smart people. This is a complicated problem. I want to hear what they have to say about it. It's a family company, and there's a sense that I get from talking to people that are associated with it that they feel that they've been mistreated by the media, by the government, by politicians, and that they feel attacked. And I was interviewing someone who was a very high opinion of the company, very high opinion of the family. He didn't want his name used because he's like, look, I stand by them 100%, but if I give you my name, then I'll be just pilloried. People look askance at me, all the internet people trolling me. And so I feel like they have this, I would say it's a well-grounded cynicism about the media and about just, coverage of their drug.
I believe that in terms of the blame for our opioid addiction epidemic, Purdue Pharma's pursuit of financial profit and the fact that they didn't care about an epidemic of addiction and overdose deaths that they were fueling, the fact that the Food and Drug Administration failed to properly regulate the claims that Purdue was making, the failure of the medical establishment, and the fact that it took money from Purdue and other opioid makers and promoted aggressive use, state medical boards that failed to regulate the way in which doctors were prescribing and even encouraged aggressive prescribing. There's a lot of blame to go around.
The question is who's guilty or who should feel guilty? I don't know that anybody feels too guilty. I kind of wish a few more people did feel a little more guilty.
Despite public outcry, pharmaceutical companies find new and creative ways to market their heroin pills.
What's next? What's in the pipeline? And we do have patent data we can imply from the patent data, and it looks to be very opioid-centric.
Including painkillers marketed to children.
The Food and Drug Administration announced about a month ago that they were determining that OxyContin is safe and effective for children 11 and up, which is very disturbing.
Most of the companies that now operate in this space have gone dark. It's not the big names that you and I would recognize, like Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson. Pfizer does have a little bit, but not a lot. It's actually these smaller, very focused companies that focus on pain, and they're not names, they're not household names. They don't have to worry as much about the sort of reputational damage.
As forces in our nation strengthen against the overprescribing of opioids, pharmaceutical companies see their U.S. market eventually narrowing. As one door closes, another opens. Purdue's private company owner's international firm, Mundipharma, has already begun the same kind of marketing campaign in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Nations where chronic pain is high and people haven't the money or access to medical treatment. Communities ill-equipped to handle an opioid epidemic.
Mundipharma believes in the ethos of reaching every single person who needs our medicines and products. In emerging markets, we are leveraging our global leadership in pain management. This is our little